It wasn't supposed to happen. I never planned for it. But then again, nothing ever really does it? You can't plan when desire comes knocking on your door, when a spark of something forbidden flickers and burns deep inside you. It catches you unaware, and suddenly, everything you thought you knew about yourself, about your marriage, is questioned. I didn't ask for this, but I can't say I didn't want it. My name is Rebecca, and I've been married to Jason for 8 years. A perfect marriage on paper. A handsome, successful husband. A beautiful home. We even had a garden that could be featured in any high-end design magazine. But behind the picture-perfect image, something was missing. I can't tell you exactly when it started, but the flame that once burned brightly between Jason and me had begun to flicker out. And no matter how much I tried to ignore it, there it was, lingering in the background, a cold emptiness I couldn't shake. Jason was away a lot for work. I was used to it by now, used to the quiet. Some days I would spend hours in the garden, pulling weeds, pruning flowers, and rearranging the shrubs. It became my sanctuary, my escape. I would lose myself among the roses, the lavender, and the ivy, almost forgetting that I had a life outside of this place. Then there was him. His name was Gabriel, and he worked for the landscaping company that took care of our garden. He was young, probably in his late 20s, and from the first time I saw him, I couldn't help but notice the way his hands moved, strong, yet gentle, as he tended to the plants. The way he carried himself was different from the other workers. There was a quiet confidence in him that I hadn't seen in a long time, not even in Jason. Gabriel wasn't just good at his job. He was attractive. I didn't want to admit it at first, but the more I saw him, the more I began to notice how he made my heart beat a little faster, how his presence seemed to spark something inside me I hadn't felt in years. He was tall, with dark, unruly hair, and a quiet intensity in his eyes. His smile was charming, but it wasn't until I started talking to him more that I realized there was something else. A magnetism I couldn't explain. I would find excuses to be outside, to walk around the garden and check on the progress of the landscaping. Every time I saw him, I would feel a rush of excitement, a warmth spreading through me that I couldn't ignore. One afternoon, as I was sitting on the back porch, sipping lemonade, I saw him tending to a row of bushes near the fence. I had been in my own world, but something about the way the sunlight hit his face made me stop in my tracks. He caught my gaze, and for a split second, I felt a spark between us. I don't know if he noticed it too, but he smiled at me. Just a small, knowing smile that made my pulse race. I shook myself out of my reverie, trying to push the thoughts away. I was married. I had no business thinking about another man, especially not like this. But despite myself, I found my eyes wandering back to him. He was just so confident, so self-assured. And I couldn't help but notice the way his body moved, the way his muscles flexed as he worked. He was fit, strong. He was everything Jason wasn't, or at least everything I wasn't feeling from Jason anymore. "Hey, Gabriel," I called, standing up and walking toward him. I tried to sound casual, but my voice felt like it was betraying me, a little too breathy. "You're doing a great job with the garden. It looks amazing." He looked up, his dark eyes meeting mine, and for a moment, I thought he was going to say something about the weather or the flowers or something equally harmless. But instead, his lips curled into that same small, knowing smile. "Thank you, Mrs. Monroe," he said, his voice low and easy. "It's a pleasure working here. The garden really has a soul. It feels peaceful." There was something about the way he spoke that made the world around me seem quieter, almost as though his words were intended for only me. "You've been working in gardens for long?" I asked, trying to keep the conversation light. "A few years now, Gabriel said, bending down to pull a weed from the ground. I like the work, it's steady, but more than that, it's just nice. Being around nature, it feels grounded. I nodded, unable to tear my gaze away from him. There was a rawness to his words, an honesty that felt refreshing. I wanted to ask him more questions, but I didn't know what to say. I was aware of how silly I must look, standing there, watching him with far too much interest. As if sensing my hesitation, he looked up at me again, that smile of his widening just slightly. I'm glad you like it, he said. I'll finish up soon, but if you want, I can help you with whatever you need. I smiled, trying to keep the conversation light. I'm just enjoying the view. You've done enough for today. I don't want to keep you from your work. But something in his eyes told me he wasn't done yet. There was a flicker there, a spark of something more. I couldn't help but wonder if he felt it too. He paused, his gaze softening as he slowly stood up. Well, if you ever need anything, you know where to find me, Mrs. Monroe. That was the moment it started, the moment I knew I was in trouble. That quiet, simple exchange, those few seconds of shared unspoken tension, would be the catalyst that would lead to everything. And that's when I made a decision I'd regret, a decision I couldn't take back. I'd always thought of myself as a woman of morals, a woman who did the right thing. But in that moment, I realized the right thing didn't always feel right, not when the forbidden was calling to me so strongly. Actually, Gabriel, I said, my voice almost a whisper, there is one thing you could do for me. Would you like to come inside for a drink? Just to cool off? His eyes locked with mine, and for a moment I saw something shift. He didn't say anything at first, but his eyes said it all. There was no turning back. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as Gabriel looked at me, his dark eyes searching mine. I almost wished he would say something, anything to break the tension. But instead, he simply nodded. His smile grew just a little wider, but there was something more to it now, a hint of curiosity, maybe even desire. Sure, Mrs. Monroe, he said, his voice still calm, but I could hear the change in it, the subtle deepening of his tone. A drink sounds nice. It was strange, inviting him into my home. I'd never thought I would be in this situation, not with someone like him. Gabriel was young, too young, or at least I had always thought of myself as someone who didn't give in to such temptations. But standing there with him, my thoughts became clouded, and I found myself leading him toward the back door without even thinking about it. As we entered the kitchen, I motioned to a chair by the counter. I felt the need to keep the conversation light, keep everything normal, but deep inside, I knew that normal was slipping through my fingers, just like sand in the wind. Would you like something cold to drink? I asked, opening the fridge and reaching for a bottle of iced tea. My hands were shaking slightly as I poured the drink into 2 glasses, trying to keep my composure. Yeah, that'd be great, he answered, stepping closer. I could feel his presence like an electric charge in the air, his proximity stirring something inside me I hadn't felt in years. I handed him a glass, our fingers brushing as he took it from my hand. The contact was brief, but it sent a jolt of heat rushing through me. I took a sip of my own drink, trying to keep my focus, but I couldn't help the way my eyes kept drifting to him. He was so close now, closer than I had ever allowed myself to imagine. So, I began, my voice sounding a little too strained. How did you end up working in landscaping? I mean, you've got such a knack for it. Gabriel leaned against the counter, his gaze steady as he met mine. I've always loved working outside, he said. It's in my blood, I guess. My family's from the country, and I grew up on a farm. Being out here, with the earth, it just feels right. I nodded, trying to keep the conversation going, but my thoughts were scattered. I was acutely aware of the way he was standing, his body slightly turned toward me, the subtle shift in his posture that suggested he was no longer just a worker at my house. He was a man who saw me in a different way. "I can tell," I said softly, not sure if I was talking about the garden or something else entirely. There was a beat of silence, a moment that stretched too long, and then Gabriel took a step closer. My breath hitched in my throat as I found myself frozen, unable to move, unable to speak. His eyes never left mine, and for a long moment, all I could hear was the sound of my own heartbeat, thundering in my ears. "You don't have to pretend with me, Rebecca," he said quietly, using my first name for the first time. It sent a shiver down my spine, a cold and hot rush that made my pulse race even faster. "I know what's going on. You don't have to act like this is just a drink between neighbors." The air between us felt thick with tension, as if it was charged with something we both knew was inevitable. My mind screamed at me to step back, to stop it before it went any further, but my body didn't listen. My heart wasn't listening. I was already in too deep, lost in something I couldn't name. "Gabriel, I began, but he interrupted me, his voice softer now, his hand brushing against my arm. "You don't have to say anything," he murmured. "I can tell, and honestly, I think you want this as much as I do." And before I could stop myself, I found my hand reaching out, trembling, until it rested lightly on his chest. It was as if my body had already decided what I wanted, what it needed, without consulting my mind. I felt the heat of his body through the fabric of his shirt, and the contact was like fire, sparking a desire I could no longer ignore. Gabriel looked down at my hand, his gaze following the trail of my fingers. His lips parted slightly, and in that instant, I knew I had crossed a line. I had crossed it willingly, and now there was no turning back. Slowly, as though he was testing the waters, Gabriel's hand moved to mine, his fingers curling around my wrist gently. He lifted my hand from his chest, guiding it up to his neck, where his skin was warm and smooth under my touch. He didn't say a word, but his eyes spoke volumes. He was waiting for me to make the next move. And I did. I closed the space between us, my lips meeting his in a kiss that was slow at first, tentative but quickly grew more urgent, more demanding. The taste of him was intoxicating, his kiss deeper and more passionate than anything I had felt in a long time. My mind was screaming, telling me to stop, but my body was already lost, already giving in to the overwhelming wave of desire that crashed over me. Gabriel's hand slid into my hair, pulling me closer, deepening the kiss. My body responded to him instinctively, pressing against his, feeling the heat of him, the strength of him, as if I could drown in it. I was trembling, my knees weak as he guided me toward the counter, his lips never leaving mine. For a moment, I forgot about everything. About Jason, about the life I had carefully built. All that mattered in that instant was the heat between us, the undeniable pull, the feeling of his hands on my body. And then, as if by instinct, I found myself pulling away, breathless, my heart racing in my chest. I looked at him, my eyes wide with a mixture of shock and something darker, something far more dangerous. "God," I whispered, my voice shaking. I shouldn't have done that. Gabriel didn't say anything at first. He simply watched me, his dark eyes filled with something I couldn't quite name. Then slowly, he reached up to touch my face, his fingers brushing my cheek. "It's okay," he said softly. "You wanted it. I can tell." And in that moment, I knew he was right. I had wanted it. I still wanted it. The silence that followed his words was thick, heavy, almost suffocating. Gabriel's fingers still hovered near my face, his touch so soft, so gentle, as though he were afraid to break something fragile between us. But inside, I was anything but fragile. I felt wild, untamed, alive in a way I hadn't felt in years. I stepped back, just enough to regain some sense of control, Or at least I thought I was. My mind was reeling, torn between the guilt that screamed at me to stop and the heat that was burning through my veins, urging me to let go. I can't keep doing this, I murmured, though even as I said the words, I knew they were hollow. My voice faltered, betraying the truth I had buried deep within myself for too long. The truth was, I didn't want to stop. I didn't want to walk away from this. Gabriel didn't press me. He simply stood there, watching me with that quiet intensity in his eyes, as if he could read every thought, every unspoken word, and it was both comforting and terrifying. "You don't have to," he said softly, taking a step closer again, closing the space between us. He lifted his hand to touch my cheek, the warmth of his touch grounding me, making everything else fade into the background. "I know what you need, Rebecca, and I'm not going anywhere." My breath caught in my throat. His words, so simple, so sure, rang in my ears, making my heart race all over again. It wasn't just the kiss, the touch. It was the way he made me feel seen, heard, wanted. Something Jason hadn't made me feel in, well, it felt like forever. Before I could say another word, Gabriel leaned in, his lips capturing mine once more. This time, there was no hesitation, no doubt. The kiss was urgent, consuming, as if we were both starved for something we couldn't name. My body responded instantly, pressing into him, my hands moving to his chest, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat beneath my fingertips. I could taste the sweetness of the iced tea still lingering on his lips, but it was quickly replaced by something much deeper, something more intoxicating. His mouth was hot, his kiss demanding, and it sent waves of heat through my entire body. My hands roamed to his back, pulling him closer, feeling the muscles under his shirt tense as he responded with equal fervor. The air between us grew thick, charged, almost electric, and I could barely think straight anymore. Every inch of my skin felt alive, craving more, wanting to be touched, to be felt. I could hear the faint sound of my own breathing, shallow and quick, as if the very act of being near him was taking all the air from my lungs. When Gabriel's lips moved from my mouth to my neck, I let out a breathless gasp, my hands gripping his shoulders for support. I could feel the heat of his breath on my skin, the soft press of his lips as he kissed the sensitive spot just below my ear. His hands slid down my back, pulling me closer still, until there was no space left between us. I could feel his body, strong and solid against mine, and suddenly, everything seemed to disappear. All the doubts, all the guilt, all the reservations. They vanished. I wasn't thinking anymore. I was just feeling. I was lost in the moment, lost in the desire that had been building between us for weeks, months, maybe even longer. I wanted him, and I didn't care if it was wrong. Gabriel's hand moved to the small of my back, pressing me against him, and I could feel the unmistakable pressure of his arousal against my abdomen. It made my breath catch in my throat, the sudden realization that this was no longer just about kissing, no longer just about shared touches and stolen moments. This was real, and I wanted it. I wanted him. Before I knew it, I found myself pulling away, just enough to catch my breath, my hands shaking as I tried to steady myself. Gabriel looked at me, his eyes dark and filled with a hunger I knew mirrored my own. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice low and thick with desire. I didn't answer with words. Instead, I took a step back, slowly undoing the buttons of my blouse, my fingers trembling but determined. The room was spinning, but my focus was razor-sharp on him. I could feel the heat of his gaze on me, the intensity of his stare as I revealed more of myself to him, one button at a time. When I finally shrugged the blouse off my shoulders, Gabriel stepped forward again, his hands reaching for me, but I stopped him, placing my palm on his chest. I could feel the thudding of his heart beneath my hand, and the sensation sent a shiver down my spine. "You're sure?" I repeated, my voice trembling. He didn't say anything this time. Instead, he gently cupped my face with both hands, tilting my chin upward so that I had no choice but to meet his gaze. There was no hesitation in his eyes, no uncertainty, just raw desire. And in that moment, I realized that I didn't need to say anything more. I knew what we both wanted. We knew what we were about to do. Without another word, he closed the distance between us again, his lips finding mine in a kiss that was deeper, more urgent than before. I could feel the desperation in him, the hunger that had been building just beneath the surface, and I matched it with my own. As his hands slid under my skirt, lifting the fabric higher, I felt a rush of excitement, of anticipation. The moment we had both been edging toward had finally arrived. I felt alive, electrified. Every part of me was on fire, every touch, every caress, heightening the need inside me. His fingers skimmed the bare skin of my thighs, sending waves of pleasure through me, and I gasped into his mouth as his hand moved higher, tracing the curve of my body with deliberate slowness. "God, Rebecca," he murmured against my lips, his voice hoarse. "You're so beautiful." I didn't answer him. Words weren't enough. Not when every inch of my skin was on fire with the need to feel him, to feel everything he had to offer. I pushed him gently back, guiding him toward the counter where I had been standing just moments before. His body moved with mine, the heat between us building, feeding on itself until it was unbearable. The rest of my thoughts faded into the background. I wasn't thinking about Jason anymore. I wasn't thinking about anything except the man in front of me, the man who was about to become my forbidden indulgence. His hands moved to my waist, lifting me onto the counter, his body following closely as he settled between my legs. His breath was ragged against my neck, and as he kissed me once more, I knew that there was no turning back from this. I was lost, and I wasn't sure I wanted to be found.